So when we think about Mark Twain, we think about him as an author and a humorist. We think about Life on the Mississippi, Huckleberry Finn. What I like to do, though, is to start the talk off with some of his business maxims that have tickled me, to say the least. So I have a few I'll give you right here. On bankers. A banker is a fellow who lends you his umbrella when the sun is shining and wants it back the minute it begins to rain. On diligence. Diligence is a good thing, but taking things easy is much more restful. And then dressing for success. Clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence in society. And on honesty, this is a very popular one. Honesty is the best policy when there is money in it. And another one on money. The lack of money is the root of all evil. And I think that's the title, actually, of another Twain book. Okay, on investing. This is a popular one, but one of my favorites. October. This is one of the peculiarly dangerous months to speculate in stocks. The others are July, January, September, April, November, May, March, June, December, August, and February. A couple more. Prosperity. Few of us can stand prosperity. Another man's, I mean. And then finally on success. All you need in this life is ignorance and confidence, and then success is sure. And that's partly where the title of the book comes from. And the rest of the title comes from Twain's filthy rich friends, who actually end up bailing him out there at the 11th hour and then set him up with some rather nice investments at the end of his life. And he dies a relatively wealthy man. So it's a happy ending to the story. Now, Twain could certainly turn a phrase, but you'll discover there's a lot more to him than just his observations that then become business maxims. You'll learn that he actually considered himself a hard-nosed businessman. He considered himself a visionary inventor and investor, a venture capitalist, a media mogul, and a pioneering marketing and salesman. He had unbelievable successes and failures, of course, and it was a real roller coaster of a ride, but in my mind, that's what really gave him more of a human quality. And obviously, I'm going to talk about that side of his life tonight. And you know, this dichotomy between Twain, the author, and Clemens, the businessman, really hit home with me when after I'd actually finished the book. I was doing this radio interview on NPR's Marketplace, which maybe some of you listen to. And it was, the interviews they're great. I mean, they know their stuff. And so we're talking about Clemens as the businessman, and then we start talking about Twain, and we started mixing up Twain and Clemens, and usually we should have just stuck with Twain, because generally that's what everyone does. But Kai Risdahl, who did the interview, and he's a pretty knowledgeable, bright guy. I mean, he was as tongue-twisted as I was when it came to trying to separate things. So it was just a great example of trying to deal with this sort of schizophrenic life that Twain had. Obviously, there's been many biographies on Twain, and they do touch on his business side, but I think, or at least I found that many of them tend to gloss over the business side because it got a little dirty there for a while. It wasn't necessarily a high point in his career, and of course they want to focus on all the wonderful literature. So in my view, there was room for a book like this. And as Barb mentioned, it came from when I was working on a full biography of Andrew Carnegie, where I was going through his letters, really starting from scratch. And I didn't know at that time too much about Twain, except what I had taken in high school or college as far as courses. And there were a few letters in there where clearly Twain was up to something. He had some kind of scheme going that he was trying to rope Carnegie into. And the one letter in particular that struck me was this letter to Carnegie's daughter, actually, where Twain is asking her to ask him for a $2,500 investment in a scheme Twain is involved with. And he advises her to get him a nice big drink of scotch before she asks for the money. Now, the problem is his daughter's only 3 years old at the time. So, right away, obviously, old Andrew is reading this letter and not the daughter. And in fact, Twain didn't get that money, even though he really did want it. So anyway, I was a little bit intrigued, and I have an undergraduate degree in economics, but then I went on and got a master's in literature. So it seemed like, if I could pull together a business book with Twain, what could be better? Because, it's just so much fun to read him anyway. And you'll find in this book that it's really a derivative book. There's not a whole lot of new scholarship. In fact, I did almost all of the research sitting at home, because everything, which was mind-boggling to me, everything just about that he ever wrote is online. So that's where I spent my research time. So it wasn't really very romantic, but it was time effective. Now, when I was doing the research, I was looking at what had been produced by Twain to date, and reading criticisms of those books. And the one thing that I noticed was that the readers really wanted to hear more of Mark Twain's voice, within a biography. So that's something I kept in the back of my head, because, I want to read more of him than me too, even though it's my book. So what I did was, when you go and you look at this book, you'll see it's not a traditional design for a biography. It's a short biography to begin with. It only focuses really on his business side. But you'll have a main chapter, and then after it, you'll have a little section I called Quirky Habits and Brazen Philosophy. And that's where I try to work in an essay or a speech or edited versions thereof of just Twain, but giving advice on things that the business reader are going to want to know about. So, for example, one is even a crank knows to dress for success, and that's about how Twain's white suits came about, according to him. Another one is on his stormy work habits and the way he worked. He'd strip off his shirt, he'd have cigars going. He'd work himself up into a froth, which is just a wonderful image. So there's something on that. There's also, since we're talking about smoking, obviously he's famous for his cigar smoking, and I love the stories where he would go over to a friend's house, and he was going to be spending the night, and he always fell asleep with a cigar in his mouth. So they would always have to go up to the bedroom to remove the cigar. It's like their last thing before they themselves went to bed. And he wrote an essay called Smoking as Inspiration. And so I figured I had to work this in somehow, because obviously it's inspired him quite a bit over the years. So I'm just going to read just a brief passage from this particular section. I have not had a large experience in the matter of alcoholic drinks. I find that about 2 glasses of champagne are an admirable stimulant to the tongue, and is perhaps the happiest inspiration for an after-dinner speech which can be found. But as far as my experience goes, wine is a clog to the pen, not an inspiration. I have never seen the time when I could write to my satisfaction after drinking even 1 glass of wine. As regards to smoking, my testimony is of the opposite character. I find cigar smoking to be the best of all inspirations for the pen, in a particular case, no sort of detriment to the health. During 8 months of the year I am at home, and that period is my holiday. In it, I do nothing but very occasional miscellaneous work. Therefore, 300 cigars a month is a sufficient amount to keep my constitution on a firm basis. During the family summer vacation, which be here. I work 5 hours every day and 5 days in every week and allow no interruption under any pretext. I allow myself the fullest possible marvel of inspiration. Consequently, I ordinarily smoke 15 cigars during my 5 hours labors, and if my interest reaches the enthusiastic point, I smoke more. I smoke with all my might and allow no intervals. So, obviously, he loved his cigars. Now, what I'd like to do is take a quick walk through the different phases of his business life. Some of it you'll be familiar with, some perhaps not. And just, we can't get in too much depth here, but just look a little bit at what's going around in the country, how his life reflects what's going on in the country at that time, and perhaps get a little insight into his personality too. Now, he was born in 1835, so he's going to come of age during the Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, which of course is a term he coins with the book of the same name. And his contemporaries are Andrew Carnegie, in fact, born the same year, and also John D. Rockefeller was born 4 years later. So he's going to come of age with these tycoons and be exposed really to the same kind of opportunities that they had during the Industrial Revolution. Now, prior to Twain's birth, his family experienced a little bit of that pioneer life in Tennessee, and his father, and this is a well-known episode, his father bought a large chunk of land in Tennessee, convinced that it was going to yield great wealth for the family. And this is important because it never did, and it just really haunted Twain throughout his life, that this had never yielded the fortune that was expected. And in fact, later on, even when there was an opportunity to sell the land for $200,000, which would have been a sizable windfall, his brother put the kibosh on it because the purchaser wanted to turn part of it into a wine vineyard, and his brother was at that time a teetotaler. So you can imagine how Twain would have reacted. Now, the thing about his father, Twain's father, was he wasn't a great businessman, obviously, and the family ends up relatively destitute. So Twain grows up with a fear of poverty, and that can't be discounted. When I was studying Andrew Carnegie, it was the same sort of situation. That the family was really destitute when they immigrated to Pittsburgh, and he talked about being haunted by the wolf of hunger, and it lasted right through his entire life. And you see that with Twain as well. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, before he was 12 years old, he'd worked in a grocery store, a bookstore, a blacksmith shop, an apothecary, and according to Twain, he excelled in all those jobs. He said he excelled at getting fired. But nevertheless, he was showing some diligence. Now, his father dies in 1847, so that's the end of Twain's formal education. He is now apprenticed to the local printer of the newspaper, and this is when he begins to learn to set type. And the critical thing about this, as far as Twain's development goes, is that, as he's setting type, he's reading the stories, he's beginning to see how the world works. It's really his secondary education. Even his business education, he's learning what businesses are failing, which ones are booming, how the goods are flowing up and down the Mississippi River. And again, to draw a comparison to someone like Carnegie, who was a telegraph operator around this same time in his life, all that information is flowing in and out. It was essentially the internet of their age. So this was an important phase. And what was really interesting to me, he was a typesetter basically from 1847 to 1856. What was interesting in reading the letters home to his mom, to his sister, brother, he was always very concerned about his production, his level of production, quantity and quality, and he comes across as being very, very anal. And I would never think of Twain as that way. This is the cigar-smoking guy who's writing some pretty racy books later on in life. But he was really focused on details. And it's actually the same when he starts writing, as you see that same kind of focus on, how many pages of manuscript have I churned out in my, 2 or 3 months here at Quarry Farm. He was always very focused on that. Now, thankfully, he's going to leave the typesetting business behind in 1856. And the way that comes about is he's working for a printer up the Mississippi River a bit, I believe, from where he was born. And he's setting, a story, and it's about this incredibly powerful plant down in South America that has this plant that has magical qualities. And he gets the eureka, I've got to get there, and I'm going to import this plant and make a fortune. I mean, that was his plan. Now, as far as what was going on in the United States at that time, in 1854, so we're talking 2 years prior, you had the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened up huge amounts of Western territory for settling. And there was this whole new infusion of energy into, this spirit moving westward, and Twain is definitely infected by that. So there he is, he's reading this story, and he's like, I need an adventure, I got to get out of here. So his plan is to take a steamboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and from there he's going to take a boat to the mouth of the Amazon, then travel up the Amazon. He's going to find this magical plant and export it back to the United States and make a fortune. Unfortunately, when he gets to New Orleans, he finds out that there are no boats that go to the Amazon River. So he's stuck there, and he's blown all his money getting there. Now, the plant he's talking about, of course, is the coca plant that you use to make cocaine. And the story he was reading about, no doubt, was about the natives who would chew it and just have wonderful levels of energy and work 14 hours a day. So if there had been a boat to the Amazon, and instead of becoming a writer, he could have formed the first cocaine cartel. But that's just speculation, really. So anyway, so he's in New Orleans, and this is when he then wrangles a job learning how to become a steamboat pilot. And it pays $250 a week. It's a great job. It's something all the boys in the Mississippi, of course, always dreamed of. And just a couple points here to sort of tie in with his business development. Again, as he's moving up and down the river, he's exposed to all sorts of information, all sorts of wheeling and dealing. And at the same time, what's interesting to me about this job is that it's really the antithesis of being a typesetter. You're out there, the river's always changing, you have to improvise. So he's learning a whole new set of skills. Now, I had dinner with Michael from the Elmira College, and he pointed out, though, that you actually, as a riverboat pilot, you have to be very systematic as well, just like a typesetter, in how you remember the river and navigating the river. So anyway, his education continues. Now, his first boss, he's a cub pilot. He's got his boss, the captain, and I'm just going to quote just a little snippet here. Now, this is from, some of these quotes are letters. Some are from his autobiography, and you always have to take those autobiographies with a grain of salt, because there's a lot of revisionism going on in there, but it's really well written, so you want to use it anyway. That's the problem you're faced with. So he hates his boss, and he has dreams of killing him like 17 different ways, he says. The guy's a real tyrant, and I love this description. I mean, this is what young kids learning to write need to read this stuff. He says of his boss, he was a middle-aged, long, slim, bony, smooth-shaven, horse-faced, ignorant, stingy, malicious, snarling, fault-finding, moat-magnifying tyrant. I guess you get the picture. So we're in his steamboat phase. which ends pretty quickly because, of course, Civil War breaks out in 1861. So he's only on the river, really, a couple of years when he's his own man. And so he has to quit the river, and he enlists briefly in the Confederate Army, but then he quits just about as quickly because he says he gets tired of retreating all the time. Unfortunately, I guess Grant was operating in that area and wasn't too cushy like out in Virginia. But now at the same time, his older brother Ryan has been appointed Secretary of the Nevada Territory. Now 2 years prior, in 1859, the biggest silver lode to date ever discovered was discovered out in Nevada Territory, not far from Carson City and all that Wild West stuff. So his brother gets this wonderful appointment to be secretary out there in 1861, and Twain decides that he's going to tag along because there's a fortune to be made out there. He's just not sure how yet, but there is. Now he's age 25 at this point. So they head out there, and there's, of course, the great stories about the duels and gunfights, whiskey drinking, gambling, and all that sort of thing. But as Twain is surveying the opportunities, he says, okay, I don't know that I'm equipped to really get into silver mining. That takes a fair amount of capital, but I can support that industry by going into the lumbering business. And so he and a friend go out toward Lake Tahoe, and they stake a claim in the woods there. Because back then, you could stake a claim, and as long as you started working it, it was yours. So again, now we have to be careful how much truth is in this story because Twain liked to tell, fish stories on occasion. But they go out there and they set up camp, they make a campfire, then they go off for a walk to survey the land. And when they come back, the campfire, being that they're amateurs at camping, the campfire has spread, and it spreads enough, let me put it this way, that it burns down their claim. So that was his initiation into business out west. So he goes back to Carson City with his tail between his legs and decides to dabble in mining. And the thing of it was there were people striking rich. There were guys who couldn't afford anything one day and they were drinking champagne the next, but it was a very small percentage. Nevertheless, I'll give you a little snippet here on how Twain got infected with it. He writes of that period, "By and by I was smitten with the silver fever. Plainly this was the road to fortune. I would have been more or less than human if I had not gone mad like the rest. Cartloads of solid silver bricks as large as pigs of lead were arriving from the mills every day, and such sights as that gave substance to the wild talk about me. I succumbed and grew as frenzied and as craziest as the rest." Now we're still in like 1861. He's flat broke the next year. Never struck it rich. And there's some great stories from that time period that I'm not going to get into but that are in the book because they're just funny. So what does he do? Well, his brother has a connection with a newspaper. So here's where he starts to get into writing more seriously. And it's what's the term? Invention is the mother of necessity, or something like that. Well, for Twain, that was the case, but for writing, he really had run out of options. He was flat broke, so he took this job with this newspaper. And it's 1868, so a half dozen years later is when he finally inks his first deal with a publisher for a book. And at that point, he's age 32. And I'm not going to get into all the book stuff because I don't know that enough about it. And you get a lot of that here, I'm sure. So we'll stay focused on the business. Now, what's interesting about this first book deal is that he's offered a flat fee of $10,000. Here it is. We get the book, and that's your one and only payment. Or you can take a royalty deal. So Twain he's a pretty savvy guy, and he's seen enough rip-offs and con artists out west to know that he's got to play it close to the vest, and he takes the royalty deal. instead. So he's gambling on himself. He's got a lot of confidence. Also, now this deals with the American Publishing Company. He buys a little bit of stock, as much as he can afford in the company, so he can then get their company reports and stay on top of them and know, okay, I'm selling this number of books, I should be receiving this amount of money, and it was just a very, very savvy move to make on his part. Now, when he makes this first book deal, and of course his first two books do wonderful considering they were just the first couple of books. But when he makes this deal and he starts rolling in money, we're on the cusp of the Gilded Age at that point, because really the Gilded Age is that period from the 1870s through the 1890s where there was that unbelievable ostentatious display of wealth in this country. There was a real polarization of wealth where you had the capitalists like Carnegie, and you had, the steel workers making next to nothing. So it was an interesting time. And it's in 1873 that he writes or co-authors that book entitled The Gilded Age. And, that's a lampoon of all these quick rich schemes and the corruption in President Grant's administration. Now, what struck me, though, is that here Twain is making all these observations about it, and he himself becomes a creature of the Gilded Age. He moves to Hartford where his publisher is, and because he never trusts his publisher, he's got to be looking over his shoulder all the time. What does he do? He builds a mansion and staffs it with 12 servants. Okay, he takes luxurious vacations to Europe, including Florence, where they lived in wonderful villas, and he eventually befriends tycoons like Carnegie. He liked to be around money, and of course the rich guys like to be around him for his stories. Carnegie, by the way, is only just building his first steel mill in 1874, just to keep things a little bit in perspective. Now, Twain has money rolling in from books, magazine articles, speaking engagements, and he's got money to burn. All right, in the 1870s, and he becomes smitten with technology of the Industrial Revolution, of course. Now, the typewriter comes out in 1873. He buys it as soon as it hits the store shelf, he buys that, and he's convinced it'll help him improve his productivity as an author, which would be great. But what he discovers is that his brain and fingers don't work together like they do, when you are writing. And I agree with him, So, and the other thing he discovers is that when he would just write a letter on the typewriter, everyone wanted to know what this newfangled machine was he was using. So he was getting inundated with the letters back. And if you know Twain, the last thing he wanted to do was correspond with people he thought were blithering idiots. So basically, he gave the typewriter to his publisher over at the publishing company and hoped it was a curse on him. I think he got a saddle for it, actually. Now, the other thing was the telephone. Twain was one of the first to have a telephone in a private residence. And the other thing was the phonograph. Edison's phonograph was reasonably good shape for retail sales in 1878. And Twain was enraptured with it because, again, he thought, hey, I could dictate into this thing. And again, the idea would be to boost his production. But he found, like the typewriter, that it didn't really work. There was a disconnect, and the writing wasn't nearly as good. Now, while we're on the topic of being smitten with new technologies, you all probably know the story of the Page typesetter. Does everyone pretty much know that story? Good, because that'll cut like 5 minutes out of this talk. But the important thing is that that was a Shakespearean tragedy in the works, and he ended up he met that machine in like 1880 and was still funding it right through 1894, and he ended up losing anywhere from, they estimate, $170,000 to $300,000, or 3.3 to 4.9 million in today's dollars is what he burned on that. The other point I'll bring up is that a lot of people blame that for him going bankrupt eventually in life, but that wasn't why. We'll get to that in a little bit. That certainly hurt him personally, but the money he was handing out for that was always cash on hand. So it wasn't the final dagger, so to speak. So we have this interest in technologies. Twain in the early 1870s also begins to think of himself as an inventor. You've got the Mark Twain elastic strap. If you haven't heard of this thing, it was to hold your pants up to your vest. This was before suspenders. He didn't make a dime on it, but he actually traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. To get the patent for it. Right. I mean, he was burning a lot of time on something that didn't make him a dime. Then there was the world's only rational scrapbook, he called it, which actually he ended up making tens of thousands of dollars. He did pretty good with this one. But again, he spent an inordinate amount of time on it. There was his memory game, which I think he worked on that thing on and off for like 15 years or so, a ridiculous amount of time. He fiddled around with bed clamps. He was interested in these hand grenades that were fire extinguishers, which for him would have come in handy because of his cigar smoking. But they didn't pan out.
Did you run into the patent on the portable ice skating rink that he did?
No. Okay, so a portable ice skating rink. So he had all these things going on, and what you discover, as you look at the letters and look at his notebooks, that it's really distracting from his writing. And of course, he also becomes an investor, Wall Street investor. The stock ticker was invented in 1867, which was the machine that really brought investing to the masses, so to speak. And so by the 1870s, Wall Street is actually a tourist trap, believe it or not, because people would go there to watch, to quote, the helter-skelter motleyness of it all. So he becomes an investor, and actually this is a great one. In 1874, he invests $23,000 in an insurance company in Hartford, the Hartford Accident Insurance Company. And he's got this great little bit on why that's a wonderful business. I have to read this to you. Certainly there's no nobler field for human effort than the insurance line of business, especially accident insurance. Ever since I have been a director in an accident insurance company, I have felt that I am a better man. Life has seemed more precious. Accidents have assumed a kindlier aspect. Distressing special providences have lost half their horror. I look upon a cripple now with affection as an advertisement. I do not seem to care for poetry anymore. I do not care for politics. Even agriculture does not excite me. But to me now there is a charm about a railway collision that is unspeakable. So anyway, he starts investing heavily. By 1882, he has a portfolio of over $100,000. Some are flyers, but some are excellent investments. So he wasn't completely naive to the investing world. In fact, when he was out west, there was a lot of that kind of horse trading going on with mines. So he knew what he was up against. And actually, one of his stocks was called Adams Express. It was a freight company. And that stock was the very first stock that Andrew Carnegie invested in years earlier and became his nest egg for the steel mill. So Twain was picking some winners as well. Now, all this is going on in the 1870s, and now we reach the 1880s, a new phase in his business career, and that's of media mogul. He'd always been paranoid that his publisher was ripping him off, and he could never understand why he couldn't get more money as an author in terms of royalties. And so he decided to form his own publishing company so he would make money as the publisher and as the author, regardless of the inherent conflicts. So he forms Charles L. Webster and Company. That was his nephew-in-law, was Charles Webster. He was going to be the manager of it. Wisely, Twain was trying to keep his name out of it, and at the same time sort of massaging the ego of his nephew who was going to be in charge. He wanted to boost him up, make him feel important. The first book to come out was Huckleberry Finn. So it was a great time to do this because he knew that book was going to be a hit, and it certainly was. Now, originally he formed this company to only publish his own books, but then he found out the next year that Ulysses S. Grant was going to publish his memoirs, and he was going to do it with a magazine company, and Twain thought that was ridiculous and actually convinced Grant to come over to his firm by offering 70% of the profits, which was, a royalty rate that was unheard of. Now, the book earned Grant over $8 million in today's money and almost made Twain $4 million. It was a huge, huge hit, the biggest hit of the time. Now, what's interesting is, and this is actually detailed in another book, the other book is called Birth of a Salesman by Walter Friedman. He's a Harvard business professor, and he has a whole chapter on Twain's selling of Grant's book. And the reason why is because it was really just phenomenal what Twain was able to accomplish. He had 10,000 salesmen or canvassers to sell the books. He didn't have bookstores, right? And Twain made sure a lot of them were Civil War vets who would be hard for people to turn away. Now, and the way he set it up was that these guys had to work the rural areas first, and then the cities were the prize. And he also put together a handbook for selling Grant's memoirs, which there's more detail in here. But it had everything, for example, from when you leave someone's home, you never turn your back on them. You never approach a group of people to try to sell to someone. And it just has really good tips. What he said was, look, I don't want my salesmen to go out there and talk rot. We have to give them something to work with. So it was a notable accomplishment for sure. And of course, it put his publishing company on the map, and it's eventually going to be their success that is their downfall. What I'd like to do for just a second right now is let's talk about how Twain managed people, because that often gives you a little bit of insight into their character. Now, he's named the company after Webster, so obviously he doesn't have such an ego that it has to be Mark Twain Publishing. And he also ends up delegating a lot of authority to Webster, and he writes in March of '84, when they're first putting it together, he writes, "You are there to take care of my business, not make business for me to take care of." And he makes it very plain that Webster makes the decisions. Now, here's an example. For Huck Finn, they wanted to inspire the salesmen, push them, so they were going to offer prizes to the top salesmen. So he wrote to Webster, "As to the prizes, you can think that out and decide upon it much better than I can." So he's pretty hands-off at this point. He was also very hands-off with the artists. Obviously the illustrations were very important for these books. And apparently one of the artists came back with some pretty repulsive work for Huck Finn, mainly because he was trying to make the characters look like how Twain had described them, which some are pretty repulsive. But Twain didn't want that kind of look in his book. I guess it would scare the kids. But so he advised Webster. This is what he advised Webster to say to the artist. He says, he advised them to do not dishearten the artist. Show him where he has improved rather than where he has failed, and punch him up to improve more. So we're seeing a pretty, savvy leader here. Now, what happens in the spring of '87, we see a change. The Grant book is a huge success. Twain is rolling in more money than he could ever have imagined. And when you have more money, you have more to worry about, of course. So life gets complicated. And in fact, their bookkeeper swindles them for $25,000. And Twain feels violated, and he blames Webster for this swindle. Now, instead of going directly to Webster, which is what he should have done, he takes what I'll kindly call the Weasley way out and gets a lawyer. And he uses his lawyer, Dan Whitford, to hammer Webster for this indiscretion. And Webster is completely baffled. In April 1887, he writes, "I cannot deal with my partner in business through the intervention of an agent, No business can succeed where partners deal with each other at arm's length. And Webster's right. Their relationship disintegrates. Twain keeps beating on Webster. The publishing firm starts to stumble a little bit because they're overextended and undercapitalized. And what happens in February of '88? Webster, who was once riding high, is forced to retire. His health is broken, and he dies in 1891, a completely broken man. Now, I don't know if Twain laughed at this or not, but the cause of death on the death certificate was inflammation of the bowels. Look, I think Twain probably chuckled, because he despised Webster, and if you read the autobiography, he says it was his duty to curse Webster. But what you see is Twain could be really hard on those people that were close to him, blood relatives. Obviously, Webster was both that, through marriage and a manager. Because at the same time, he's telling his new manager, Fred Hall, this again has to do with an artist. He tells him to tell Beard to obey their own inspiration. I want his genius to be wholly unhampered. They will be better pictures than if I mixed in and tried to give him points on his own trade. So he's still being very sensible on one level in managing the business, but incredibly tough and mean-spirited on another level. And again, when I look at Andrew Carnegie, who I studied to the nth degree, it was the same thing. He drove his brother Tom, his younger brother Tom, who was his everyday business manager, much like Webster was, drove him so hard that Tom died at the age of 43, a broken man, an alcoholic, and left behind 11 kids. But I think that's what you find with these kinds of characters. I mean, they're really edgy people. Can we go like 5 more minutes, even though we're pushing the quarter of? Okay. I don't want us to turn into pumpkins or anything. Okay, 1893. We'll jump ahead. Stock market crash. It leads to what is called the Great Depression. And Twain finds himself overextended because of all the money he's been shoveling into that typesetting machine. But here's his undoing. The publishing house, which has been puttering along, has actually a really good project. It's called the Library of American Literature, and it's a multi-volume project that's bringing together all this wonderful literature, and people are buying it up. Now, the way it worked was that you would just buy a volume at a time. So while we would be taking the order, say Twain's taking the order from you, you didn't have to hand him cash till you got that first volume. Meantime, though, he has to pay a salesman a commission for the sale they just made to you. He has to pay the guy, who's binding the book. He has to pay for all that. And then finally, months later, he comes to you and he gets a payment for that first book. Meanwhile, they're binding, X number of other books and having to pay that, having to pay commissions on a much bigger sale than just a single book to Joe. And that is what causes his publishing firm to have to declare bankruptcy. They've taken out loans to try and cover this discrepancy in income and cash going out the door. The banks call on the loans. There's just no money to be had. And who comes to the rescue at this time is Hellhound Rogers, Henry Hellhound Rogers, who was a partner of John D. Rockefeller's in Standard Oil. They meet, Twain and he meet through a mutual friend. Rogers says, all right, I'm going to help you figure out how to get out of that. But it's really Rogers who says, you got to declare bankruptcy, and then, when the smoke clears, we'll piece it all back together. And that's really where the Filthy Rich Friends piece comes from, because Rogers bails him out to a certain degree, reorganizes his life, saves Twain from losing all of his books, all the royalties from those books being taken by a bank or some other creditor, and also gets him invested into all these wonderful monopolies that Rogers and Morgan and all the other tycoons are creating, like U.S. Steel and Amalgamated Copper and the consolidation of the railroads. And there's some letters in here from Twain to Rogers, basically saying, what's next? What are you going to serve me next on the silver platter? So Twain makes out okay in the end. Of course, we all know about his world tour to bring in money because Livy, his wife, absolutely doesn't want anyone to go unpaid. And he does. He pays off all his debts. Now, what would Twain be doing with someone like Rogers? I mean, you wouldn't think it. But they actually enjoyed each other's company. They were both, rapscallions to a certain degree. They both liked dirty stories, telling jokes. And Twain has a great line about Rogers. He says, he's a pirate all right, but he owns up to it, enjoys being a pirate. That's why I like him. Now, to wrap up, how serious was Twain about the business of business? I mean, from my perspective, I'll tell you that he spent, the majority of his life working on business deals, inventions, investments, and whatnot. And who knows what kind of literature, additional literature we would have gotten out of him. You have to look at Huckleberry Finn, right? Hemingway said, all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. Well, I believe he started writing that in 1876 or thereabout and finished it in 1883. And if you look at the business dealings going on in that same period, he was always setting aside Huck Finn. When Grant's book was a huge success, was he working on his own writing projects? No. In fact, his daughter wrote that Mama and I have both been very much troubled of late because Papa, since he's been publishing General Grant's book, has seemed to forget his own books and work entirely. And in fact, the next book wouldn't come out until 1889. So he was pretty obsessed with business. And I'm going to leave you with one last quote. It's his 65th birthday, right? He's in New York City. He's being feted, of course. Now, who should be the speaker that introduces him? You would think it'd be like a dean's or a literary buddy of some kind, right? But it isn't. It is James Cannon, the president of the Fourth National Bank. And this is what Twain said in his speech. This is just an excerpt. He says, I cannot say that I have turned out the great businessman that I thought I was when I began life, but I am comparatively young yet and may learn. I am rather inclined to believe that what troubled me was that I got the big head early in the game. I want to explain to you a few points of difference between the principles of business as I see them and those that Mr. Cannon believes in. He says that the primary rule of business success is loyalty to your employer. That's all right as a theory. What is the matter with loyalty to yourself? As nearly as I can understand Mr. Cannon's methods, there's one great drawback to them. He wants you to work a great deal. Diligence is a good thing, but taking things easy is much more restful. My idea is that the employer should be the busy man and the employee the idle one. The employer should be the worried man and the employee the happy one. And why not? He gets the salary. My plan is to get another man to do the work for me, in that there's more repose. What I want is repose first, last, and all the time. Now, at age 65, he was up to his eyeballs again in get-rich schemes. And, of course, he was making a fortune thanks to those stocks passed on. As far as his lasting legacy, his granddaughter, Nina, that was the last surviving member of his family, born to Clara. She died in 1966, and her estate was estimated to be worth $2 million. So, it wasn't bad. He had it pretty good. So when I say that, on the back of the cover here, that he was a highly successful businessman, you got to take that with a grain of salt. That's a fish story. That's a marketing fish story. But he was just a wonderful man to study, and I enjoyed the book very much. I'd be happy to take now any questions that you may have. Yes.
You touched on the plasma and food stuff.
In the book, yep. Yes.
Were you able to find anything more about it? 'Cause I've been doing a lot of research as well on just that particular thing, because it's actually still being produced in Italy by the Heinz Company.
Yeah. Basically, what's in the book is pretty much as far as I dug into it. There's certainly more there.
Yeah.
But if you're not familiar with this Plasman food thing, it was a food additive, and that's what he wanted the money from Carnegie for, by the way. And it was very successful in Britain. It actually made Twain money. And then they tried to introduce it in the United States, and the guys in charge were more thieves than businessmen. So.
He even went to the Lipton guy trying to get him to go in with it. He said, "This is going to cure famine in India. We have to do this." You know?
Right, right. Yes.
What about her money? I mean, did he use her money in some of this stuff?
Yes, and they tried to keep it very separated. And the way it was really Livy who offered it up. Like there's a letter in here at one point where Twain doesn't want to touch any of her money to pay off some of these debts or to keep the business going, what have you. And she writes a letter where I believe she asks the person she's writing to not to mention it to her husband, that it's okay to go tap some Langdon funds. So they did use her money to a certain degree. But now you have to realize, okay, so like when the stock market crashed, you know, a lot of her fortune got swept away too. I mean, that was a very tough period.
What year?
That was 1893. So, you know, she was, you know, the family had the coal interest and these other investments. So the family took a big hit as well.
Carnegie gave a barrel of scotch to Mark Twain. What brand of scotch did Carnegie drink?
It's probably cheap. He was Scott.
Egg or Lewis or what?
I honestly don't know.
He must have known some kind.
Yeah.
Do you know what Twain nationality he was? I mean, what was his background of immigrant background? Does anybody know that?
Barb, you know, or Michael?
His mother claimed that she was part of the British aristocracy at one point, or had a lineage back to that point. I'm not quite sure where his father, but they were both, father was considered like the first family of Virginia. So at least initially there's some sense of aristocracy in both sides.
Is that from England?
Yes.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Mr. Krass, you indicate that because of his business dealings, he often had to put off writing ventures, and perhaps we lost some great opportunity. Did you run into any specific writing projects that he set aside that never came to fruition because of his business dealings?
I didn't encounter anything specifically. I mean, he left he left a lot of material unfinished, I'm sure, but maybe more so because he didn't think it was up to snuff. But I didn't encounter any gem. I didn't go that deep. I mean, that this book was, you know, not that kind of book where you would get into that sort of research.
Maybe the change of pace helped his writing. I mean, instead of writing, I mean, he'd go off in a business pursuit and then.
Well, he certainly, when he was here, certainly generated a huge amount of material. And I don't know how much, you know, of that business life infringed on him here, but probably nothing like it would when he would be in, you know, Hartford or something. Yeah.
Are there any instances in which his business legacy has survived? Anything that we might know about that morphed or remains in business world, or inventions, or?
I don't know. I don't think so. Scrapbooks maybe, but I don't know how that all panned out down the road. I mean, his new design was certainly revolutionary, but I don't think so.
In the middle of all these enterprises, what year did he get married?
Excuse me?
What year was he married in the middle of all these enterprises?
It was 1870, right? Yeah. He was married in 1870, and he really cranks up the next year, 1871, is when all of a sudden you see him really exploding in terms of trying to invent stuff. And, you know, there's the move to Hartford, and And Hartford was, really energetic, entrepreneurial kind of place. There was a lot of industry, a lot of inventors coming there to work on things. So that certainly must have spurred his imagination.
I've never read much about his brother. How well did he do?
Orion? He didn't do very well. He was pretty flighty, I think, flaky, very idealistic, way too idealistic to make money.
Was not a writer at all.
Oh, he dabbled in writing because Twain would try to help him. And in fact, he gave Twain, I think, the tip-off that his publisher was ripping him off. So, he was a bright guy, and certainly he and Twain stayed in contact over the years. And you'll see that Twain kind of belittles him. At least in my opinion, it seems like Twain will belittle him quite frequently, but at the same time relies on him a fair amount for advice. So I'm not really sure, how that relationship worked. Okay. Well, thank you very much.